Welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
With Turn the Page podcast, and I am thrilled to have a guest on today that I met with what feels like decades ago, but it was really back in February 2020 at the Public Library Association conference in Nashville before the world changed. Would you like to introduce yourself and tell us who you are, what you do, and about the book that we'll be talking about today?
Yeah, hi, my name's Emily Levesque, and my day job, or rather night job, is I'm an astronomer and an astronomy professor at the University of Washington. And I'm here today to talk about my new book, The Last Stargazers, which gives people a sort of behind-the-scenes tour and look at what life is like as a professional astronomer.
So first and foremost, how did you get into astronomy? I am very unfortunate to say that I don't see as many stars as I did when I was a kid, and you have to travel to see them around here. So tell us about you and how this became your night job.
Oh yeah, I mean, I really was one of those people that have been interested in astronomy since I was tiny. So when I was 2 years old, in 1986, Halley's Comet made its last close pass by Earth. So some folks might remember the naked eye comet that we were all able to see in the Northern Hemisphere, I think just a few months ago in July. Halley's Comet is a very famous version of that comes around about once every 70 or 80 years or so. And in 1986, my big brother was studying it for a school project. So our whole family went out into our backyard, and I was 2. I was a little tired, a little fussy, a little scared of the dark. And then my parents pointed me up, and I was just mesmerized. And I thought the night sky was so cool. They got me to look through our little telescope or binoculars. And then after that, for years, people would ask me what I wanted to be when I grew up. And it was, I want to be a ballerina or an astronomer, or I want to be a firefighter or an astronomer, or a marine biologist or an astronomer. And astronomy and science just really stuck. So I've loved the stars since I was really little.
That's amazing. So I was a little bit older than you. I think I was about 6 when Halley's Comet came around. And I also remember desperately wanting to see it. And I was so tired, but I stayed up anyway. And as I said, I think in those days where I am on Long Island, you could see stars a lot more. It's not as much anymore. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in southern Massachusetts, so about an hour south of Boston.
Oh, beautiful. And all right.
We got pretty good stars where we were. Light pollution, unfortunately, is something that's really hitting a lot of cities. What's great is at the same time, there's places that are really putting an effort to make light pollution less of a problem. And it's great because good lights that are good for light pollution are also good energy-wise, because you direct most of the energy and most of the light down where we need it instead of up into the skies. So hopefully everybody can still manage a little bit of stargazing, even if it's not the darkest place in the world.
Sure. And recently, my family and I went on an isolation vacation up in Massachusetts, and I was able to show my children the night sky really for the first time. They had that sense of wonder that I believe 2-year-old Emily might have had. So maybe they'll be stargazers as well. So why is the book called The Last Stargazers?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the book is looking a lot at how our jobs as astronomers are changing, and the role that technology plays in professional astronomy and scientific research is immense, but it's also really shaped how we do our jobs. There are 7.5 billion people on the planet, and only about 50,000 of us are astronomers. So I think when the average person pictures what an astronomer does, they imagine somebody maybe with the telescope that they take out into their backyard every night for research that they look through with their eyes. And in truth, our professional telescopes are these building-sized, like astonishing scientific instruments, and the amount of computer science and the amount of statistics and automation that goes into them is incredible. It's wonderful for our research, but it means that sometimes stargazing for me might not mean being in my backyard looking at the stars. It might be sitting in front of my laptop. So the title, The Last Stargazers, was marking sort of the technological changes that are coming and what it means to stargaze and where sort of that human curiosity and sense of wonder belongs as we do more and more of our work with computers.
That's really interesting. It was so funny because, you know, when I first saw the title, it had very much like a Last Jedi quality, because if anybody else is a Star Wars fan, I don't know if you are,
Oh,
but
yeah.
yes, you are. So what I found interesting was, you know, like The Last Jedi is kind of a downer of a title, but it's really not very accurate, because there is, I think like the point was that there is no Last Jedi. Things just change.
I wanted this title to function that way. I meant the title to honestly be a little bit of a challenge, because people might read it and say, hey, I still stargaze. I still go out into my backyard. We have tons of people who share their enthusiasm for astronomy, either just as amateurs and as stargazing enthusiasts, or who try to come into the field. So I think it's important to continue to recognize and use the passion that makes us stargaze. And as technology improves our scientific capabilities, we need to keep in mind what value that sort of enthusiasm and sense of wonder brings to the research that we do, and the fact that humans really still have a crucial role to play when we're designing research projects or sort of thinking of new science questions to ask.
So, I mean, this book was so, I'm just looking here at all of the reviews, it was so well received. And Cosmos, Sagan's Cosmos, is kind of name dropped several times. Were you a fan? I know that it's sort of become, would a zeitgeist be an appropriate thing to say at this point?
I think maybe. So I know that I got exposed to as much astronomy as I did because my parents watched and loved the Cosmos TV series. And his TV series actually predated his first, or the TV series predated the book Cosmos. But Sagan was a wonderful writer by then already. When I grew up, I read and just got obsessed with Contact. It was a wonderful movie. The book is spectacular, though. And I loved the story itself because it was, the main character was a scientist, and you got to see what her life was like and sort of follow all the little details of reality of somebody making contact literally with aliens, but taken from a very scientific perspective. And I loved the fact that Carl Sagan was a scientist and a writer. So it was really cool to see somebody with the kind of job that he had, and he made such a difference in terms of reaching people and getting them excited about science. And of course, that's, you know, the sort of job that I would love to have someday.
It is sort of just crucial to the way that people look at everything, that, you know, it doesn't have to necessarily be like just one thing. So the very earliest forms of astronomy, you know, obviously because people don't have the ability to use these big tower-sized telescopes anymore, how did it all begin?
It's funny. I think people imagine astronomy as the oldest science. It's described as one of the oldest sciences because it's people looking up and going, what's that? And trying to explain what they're seeing. One of the things that I love is that when people picture early astronomy, they might picture, you know, Galileo with the little, you know, balcony telescope pointing it up at the sky. And in reality, astronomy goes so much earlier than that. And it goes back to indigenous astronomers that learned immense amounts about the sky for navigation, for basically anything to do with growing things or interpreting the seasons. And a detail of early astronomy that I love when thinking about the Last Stargazers is how early storytelling came into all of it. And I mean, this was something that Carl Sagan knew better than most, that telling a good story is a great way to teach someone. And if you go back to a lot of sort of astronomy oral traditions, like Aboriginal oral traditions in Australia were describing really interesting scientific details. They were identifying variable stars, like stars that got brighter and dimmer, that we still study today with modern telescopes. And they had descriptions and backstories for these stars and passed them through generations by oral tradition. So they had an understanding of these stars that was really excellent. And then you hear about all the various stories to explain the constellations. And to me, that's just a different version of what I try to do in the Last Stargazers, because it's using storytelling and the kind of wacky adventures that we go through as professional astronomers to explain, give people a little window into what our jobs are like and explain the science behind what we do.
That's just, it's so cool. And I'm thinking of that scene from Moana, where they kind of show her ancestors navigating by the stars. And my kids were like, is that a real thing? And I'm like, yeah, it really is. So you love the storytelling aspect of it as well. Are you a fan of mythology then? Did one feed into another?
It's funny. I was never a kid that was super into mythology. I sort of learned the standard bits of mythology that you got in school. So I think we had the set of, like, Roman, Greek, and Egyptian mythology. Right. And I remember getting it opened up to me when I was like, wait, there's Aboriginal astronomy and Aboriginal mythology and indigenous mythology and Nordic mythology and all these other stories that I hadn't heard. But I was just sort of a story fan, period. So I would be equally into Egyptian mythology and the Redwall books or something like that. Like any good story that could take me into another place, I was a fan of.
Of course. So tell us a little bit about some of the adventures that that modern day stargazers and modern day astronomers experience.
Yeah, so these adventures make up a lot of the book, and some of them are based on my own experience, sort of becoming an astronomer and entering this world as somebody who, like, growing up, I didn't know any astronomers, I didn't know any professional scientists. So I use my own story as sort of the overall arc of the book, but I also interviewed more than 100 of my colleagues, and I got to ask them all sorts of questions and hear all sorts of great stories about things that had happened to them or people they knew. And one refrain that kept coming back over and over is people don't quite have a picture of what our jobs are like. I'd said before, they sort of imagine us in a backyard looking through a telescope, and we travel to some of the most remote corners of the planet. And we're sometimes at these beautiful scientific facilities, but they're in the middle of nowhere. And we'll be working at a world-class, like, finely hewn telescope, and then there will be a giant tarantula in the room next to us.
Oh my God.
What you're on the desert, you're out in the middle of the desert, and that's who you're there with.
Yeah.
Or I've talked to astronomers that have been at observatories through earthquakes or through volcanoes is one infamous story from out here in the Pacific Northwest. I had a person I interviewed who was observing, fortunately at a safe distance, when Mount St. Helens erupted, but it made for a pretty unusual morning at an observatory to suddenly wake up and see the aftermath of an immense volcanic eruption. And then, just even getting out to some of the places we go to, like astronomers observe at the South Pole, astronomers observe in airplanes that fly up to really high altitudes and then open a door so that a telescope can observe out of the open side of the plane.
Okay, so that is nuts. That's absolutely nuts. Wow. Have you yourself done that one?
I have, and I actually write about that experience in the book. I really wanted to find out what it was like to be a scientist on one of those flights, and originally tried to go just for book research, and then wound up actually having a scientific project that needed data from a flying telescope, which most people don't even realize that there is such a thing as a flying telescope.
Until right now, did not know this myself.
But so those were the sort of adventures that I wanted to share in the book. And there's a whole bunch of science that comes along with it. Why do we want to put a telescope into an airplane and fly it up to altitude? You're not really getting that much closer to the stars, but there's other reasons behind why you would want to do that. Or why do we have to put telescopes so far out into the middle of nowhere? And why do we have to build them to be the size of large buildings? And I figure putting a human face on the research and like following somebody while they, drive a car that maybe they can barely drive up this like rickety mountain road to this observatory with, tarantulas and, earthquake risk, and
It
staying with
almost
that
like
person
it
shows you
almost
what it's
sounds
like.
yeah, it almost sounds like I'm like picturing almost like an Indiana Jones-esque
It really
situation,
is.
but
Yeah.
like the idol you're stealing isn't really an idol, it's science, which is
We're
awesome.
we're stealing light, but that is something that surprises people, that there's disciplines of science that really are still a little more Indiana Jonesy than just a scientist in a lab and at a computer. And I mean, me and my colleagues, we spend plenty of time just working on data at our computers, but we get to have these adventures along the way that are really unusual. And as astronomy evolves, we maybe don't go to the middle of nowhere quite as much anymore. So part of the reason I wrote the book was somebody just needs to write these stories down and tell these stories and make sure that they're saved for people, because it's such a quirky corner of science.
So do you think, with the technology and with everything changing, do you think these adventures will continue? I mean, I would imagine there's still a need for this, be it to satiate the appetite of an adventurous scientist, and maybe because not everything can be done by computers?
It's it's something that I visit in the book, and that's become really interesting to think about now, because automation has been wonderful for astronomy this past 6 months. It's for a while not been safe to, fly halfway around the world and go to a telescope, and a lot of observatories had to close temporarily because of the pandemic. So being able to run a telescope from my laptop and from my desk has been invaluable. There's a lot of great advantages to having automation really playing a huge role in astronomy. The amount of data that we can take, how efficient we can make our telescopes, and making that data accessible to everybody, because it can be really physically arduous to go up a mountain. So the fact that you can do all this science without having to make a trek is awesome. And there's an a new set of adventures, I think, coming with the type of automation that we do. I interviewed colleagues who have built robotic telescopes or remotely operated telescopes, and there are wacky stories from those just as much as there are from people who go to a mountain in person. You do lose that particular sense of adventure of going to somewhere in the middle of nowhere, but the adventures come in different ways. One group of people I interviewed that I talk about early in the book is folks who have been observing back into sort of the first half of the 20th century. And the technology then was very different. Back then, we didn't have digital cameras, so they would use pretty classic photographic technology. They were using things like thin glass plates that could store images, and they were climbing into telescopes and sort of riding atop telescopes all night, which I've never gotten to do. And I think if you asked them, they would argue that that experience and adventure is something that's been lost. At the same time, none of them are begging to go back to an era of storing photographs on glass. They love the scientific advantages of a digital photo. So there's this simultaneous thing of like, oh, those adventures aren't going to happen again, but look at the scientific gains that we've gotten.
Yeah.
And everybody's a scientist first. So
Yeah.
we have to appreciate the science of it.
I think, first of all, your enthusiasm about all of it is just so infectious. Like, the excitement is just, it's luminous, to use, a pun. Ha 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 ha. So what is one of your favorite things that you have observed as an astronomer?
So my research specialty is I study how really big stars die. And this is something that it sounds super depressing. It's actually fascinating. So a lot of people don't realize that stars are also born. They'll sort of condense out of gas clouds, and they go through a life cycle where they fuse different elements in their cores to produce energy, and you'll see them change color and change size during their lives. And then when they end their lives, that ending depends a lot on how much mass a star has. And really massive stars produce a supernova when they die, and they make something like maybe a black hole. And those are the stars I'm interested in. I'm interested in the really weird physics that happens near the ends of these stars' lives that turns them from a big weird star into something like a black hole. So a classic version of a star like this that I bet everybody listening could recognize is Betelgeuse. So Betelgeuse is one of the stars in the constellation Orion. It's the red star in one of Orion's shoulders.
Yep.
And even if you're somewhere that isn't that dark, you can probably see it because it's so bright. Betelgeuse has actually been behaving a bit weirdly lately. It got very dim about 6 months ago. In fact, when we were all together at the PLA, I was frantically working on a research project in my spare time in my hotel room there on explaining why Betelgeuse's brightness might change so much. We think it might have happened because the star puffed off some stuff from its outer layers that condensed into dust. And when I say dust, it's not that different than the dust that you might find under your couch, and that it blocks light and makes things look dim. So Betelgeuse has to be one of my favorite things to observe, just because it's a really weird star. It's exactly the type of star I study, and it's so bright and so close that we can really look at it in amazing detail.
That's really cool. It's so funny because I just this morning, as I was driving my children they do remote school, and when I'm working a full day, a 9 to 5 day, I usually drop them off at my parents', which is around the corner from my work. But they were asking me, like, if shooting stars are real, why do they do that? And then I had to explain that some stars die, and they were like, wait, what? And it just, like, that little seed of wonder in their mind, I'm sort of connecting to this conversation. Because I
And
remember,
that curiosity
yeah.
is such a big part of how we do our research. I wrote the book as for an adult audience, but I know that one of the reviews actually also recommended it for a young adult audience because it's perfectly suitable for younger readers. And it talks about things like meteors and asteroids and how we find things that move in the night sky. So things that could potentially become what we call shooting stars. So if people are curious about that and have that whole, like, wait, what could cause this? Why does that work? There's probably a story about that phenomenon somewhere in the book, and a story about the scientists that study it and possibly the weird adventures those scientists ran into while they were doing that work.
It sounds like the perfect book for now, because we're all kind of also in a bit of a holding pattern ourselves. And this is just the perfect time to sort of marinate on things that maybe we'd wanted to look into for a while, but have not really had the chance to, because life is very fast. And I wonder, do you feel that, because you mentioned how the pandemic has kind of shifted astronomy, do you feel that this slowdown is a good time to cultivate stargazing and maybe bring new people into astronomy?
I think so. And I mean, it's been an interesting time because we've watched observatories that had to temporarily shutter because of the pandemic. And this is another thing that I always think is worth reminding people of. Astronomy and science is very much done by people. So my colleagues and I, like, our day job may involve explaining a supernova or trying to solve the mysteries of dark matter. But all of my colleagues are also dealing with things like health concerns or kids that are staying home that they're teaching, and they're parenting and doing scientific research simultaneously, or dealing with the details of stay-at-home orders. And that's become as much a part of our lives and of astronomy research as it has everybody else's. One question that I actually address late in the Last Stargazers is a question that I think a lot of astronomers get asked, which is, why do we do this, and why is it worth it? Why do we invest time and money and people's sort of professional lives into doing astronomy? And I think what struck me about it was tied up with that comet that we all saw back in July, that we've seen with the pandemic, this kind of sad power to unify people through tragedy or through shared experiences that are sad. So things like being stuck at home and not being able to see the people we care about, and worrying about health issues on a global scale. And astronomy gives people the chance to have a very large scale, like, global shared experience through joy and through something happy. Like, the number of people that stepped out into their backyard or wandered to a park, and they might have been wearing a mask and socially distanced, but the number of people that got out and grabbed their phone and tried to take a picture of the comet and got to sort of enjoy a sight like that together was really beautiful to me. And to me, that's one of the big important things about astronomy, and something that I hope can really capture people's imagination with this book right now is look at the universe beyond us that we can all really enjoy and find happiness or excitement or curiosity in together, even with everything else that's going on the planet.
So are you working on, I know you said you're a professor, are you all remote right now?
We're all remote right now. I'm teaching a class remotely. I have research students doing their research remotely. We all meet on Zoom all the time.
I know the world is all Zoom, 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 I
Yeah.
think. But are you going to work on another book?
I swore that I would take a break after finishing this one, and I can't help it. I already have ideas pinging around. I can say that I just finished working on not another book, but a lecture series for the great courses.
Which is wonderful because so many libraries have it. I would watch your lecture series.
My parents are big consumers of the great courses at their library, and I hear a lot about how much libraries love these. So it's a lecture series that'll be coming out, I believe, around next March or April. I'm not supposed to share the full description of exactly what it is, but it's very much along the same lines of astronomy and the stories of discovery in astronomy. And there's certainly some shared interest that if somebody liked the Last Stargazers, they would really enjoy this series. And I have thought about what sort of fun books there might be to write next, either about the weird stars that I study or other adventures that people have, and the stories of the sort of people and history and really human tales beyond some of the really fascinating stuff that we study in the universe. So hopefully there will be more on that before too much longer.
I am really looking forward to it. And again, as a mom of two potential stargazers, I really am excited to just share all of this with them, because I think there's so much we've traveled so much on this planet and discovered so much, but I think a big need is to we're always exploring, and I think beyond this planet is amazing wonders.
Mm-hmm. And I love that we can explore it from this planet, or
Yes.
with our eyes and with computers and with the amazing telescopes that we have available to us, that we can see so far and learn so much.
Yeah, that's true. I think science fiction is very much about getting on like the starship and exploring things, and I think, I don't know, would you say that that's kind of like a wishful thinking aspect of it, or what do you think?
I think right now, most of what we learn about space comes from telescopes and comes from studying the light or studying the signals that we get from space. And I think the idea of traveling to Betelgeuse, I mean, I would be first in line. That would be fascinating. But we don't have the technology available to us yet. And the technology we do have is so powerful that studying it the way we do now is a great approach. I mean, that said, I 100% had the sort of science enthusiasm fans flamed as a kid by watching Star Wars and watching Star Trek. I have so many colleagues that point to science fiction and that sort of storytelling as something that really helped suck them into the world of like, oh, I want to spend all my time studying space. So it's a great way to build up enthusiasm.
Cool. Yeah, I think that was like really more like what I was going for, because there is no Starship Enterprise or such right now, and like every now and then I'll ask my husband, I'll be like, would you travel into space if and he's just like, only if it was like like the comfort of a place of a ship like that where I could like go back to my room and like take like a normal shower and stuff, but the way that you're doing it on computers, you can do that, because you can, like you're your own starship through technology.
Very much. Nice.
Anyway, well, this has been really, really cool. So the book, when did it officially come out?
So the book was released back on August 4th.
Okay. So it's available anywhere. Your library, bookshop.org, wherever books are acquired. And and I encourage anybody to go pick it up. And I think Emily's enthusiasm is absolutely infectious. And hopefully, as Rey is not the last Jedi, the Last Stargazers is more of a hopeful title than.
Absolutely.
Yes. All right. So this is Jessica, and my guest today was
Emily Levesque.
We are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.